I'm Mike Jackson, WERC's Vice President of Public Policy and Research. And I'm joined on this one take today with two of WERC's external lobbyists who advocate on behalf of the talent mobility industry on Capitol Hill to support the talent mobility industry on a range of issues. Tracy Taylor with AGS and Tristan North. We're going to talk today about the current state of play on Capitol Hill regarding the tax provisions and the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as the current state of play related to the moving expense tax deduction and exclusion. In the last 3 months, there have been a lot of back and forth on how to proceed with this process and through a process called budget reconciliation. And over the course of the conversation, we're going to talk about what exactly this is. Why is this important, and how is it going to be the conduit for pushing forward several priority areas for the administration, including the extension of the tax cuts? And so to kick things off, let's level set with some foundational history of the items that we're going to be talking about today. And Tristan, why don't we start with you? And can you provide some background on the history of the moving expense tax deduction and exclusion?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. So when we're talking about the moving expense tax deduction and exclusion, we are talking about two different tax provisions, just so we're all clear. So the moving expense tax deduction are those situations where you can actually deduct from your tax return different allowable expenses from the cost of moving, such as paying a mover to physically relocate your personal household goods. Now, when we go over to the exclusion, that references when an organization, an employer reimburses an individual for the different moving expenses that weren't captured within the deduction that the individual actually took from their tax return. So just want to make sure we're all clear that we're talking about two different provisions here. And those two provisions had for decades benefited from wide bipartisan, bicameral support in Congress because members of Congress recognize the economic and individual impact and benefit from those two provisions. Now, when we got to the Job Cuts and Taxes Act of 2017, those were scaled back because there were additional cuts made for and tax relief for both individuals and corporations that offset, in the minds of legislators, more individual targeted tax relief, such as the moving expense tax deduction and exclusion. So unfortunately, despite the efforts of Worldwide ERC, the American Trucking Association Moving and Storage Conference, and the International Association of Movers, in pushing to preserve those tax benefits, they were suspended from 2018 until the end of 2025. Like I said, there were efforts to reinstate it. One of them was during Senate Finance Committee consideration of the 2017 law, in which former Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, actually offered an amendment, although it was not voted on, to reinstate those. So right now we are operating under a state where the tax provisions are currently suspended and end at the end of this year as far as that provision.
Great, thanks, Tristan. And as a follow-up, you talked about some, the history of how the moving expense tax deduction ended up, ended up being one of the areas, impacted as a result of the TCJA. But within the act passed in 2017, what were some of the key areas that were included in terms of tax changes or tax benefits for individuals or companies within?
Yeah, so the two biggest ones that I was referencing earlier were the reductions in tax brackets and the amount of taxes that were paid by businesses. So that was greatly reduced, as well as for individuals. So those, at least in the corporate tax reduction, that was made permanent. However, the reduction in taxes for individuals was also made temporary through the end of this year. So you'll hear a lot of discussion about, if Congress doesn't act, that there will be actual tax increases. So that's what really Congress had been focusing on, was doing away with a lot of the more specific and the moving tax deduction expense deduction and exclusion were by no means the only ones. A number of provisions were suspended through the end of this year to offset the cost of those lowering of the individual tax reductions or tax relief for a temporary basis and then a permanent basis for corporations.
Great, thanks, Tristan. The next foundational piece I want to touch on is the reconciliation process itself. Tracy, what is reconciliation and where do we stand with that process to date on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, thank you. This year, as Tristan said, the tax TCJA needs to be extended, or rates will increase for individuals, and because it expires at the end of the year. This can really only be done given the political dynamic in Congress right now on a partisan basis, and a procedure that's often used when you need to have one party drive a process is reconciliation. And reconciliation is a budget process that allows a simple majority in the Senate to approve a major deficit reduction or tax-related legislation. It's typically used when leadership wants to pass a measure in which they can only get a simple majority in the Senate. With the current Senate composition of 53 Republicans to 47 Democrats, reconciliation is needed to accomplish the president's major policy goals, which is extending this TCJA. And he also, in addition to the TCJA part included in this new package will be expanding border protection, another major priority of his. But complicating matters this year, the House, which can pass legislation by a simple majority, has an even tighter margin in which they can only lose 2 of their members if Democrats vote together. So yesterday, what we saw was the House narrowly pass the Senate's budget instructions, closing out the first step in the budget reconciliation process. This only occurred after we saw holdouts securing agreements from House and Senate leaders, including a commitment from Speaker Johnson to maintaining linkages with any provisions that result in a debt increase, either via spending or revenue hike with federal spending reductions. This is the first step of the 5 steps needed to pass reconciliation. And some may argue it's the easiest step because it really only required the approval of top line numbers. In other words, the battle over the nitty-gritty of what actually is in the bill and what gets cut to pay for the tax extension of the tax reduction will ultimately be included in that'll be the next step in the process. This bill is somewhat unique in that the House target for deficit reduction was 1.5 trillion in spending cuts, and the Senate target was only 400 billion. It's a little unclear and unprecedented really to move forward like this, and it could cause problems, particularly with the tight majorities and the deficit hawks in the House. Senator Thune has publicly agreed to trying to get to a larger deficit reduction number, but it's unclear how much he'll be able to get and whether he'll be able to bring his conference along for that. Another important factor here is the bill assumes a current baseline. In other words, provisions from the tax extension and the pay-fors are baked into the starting point from where we are right now.
Great. And following up, you talked about the details, and the budget instructions gave us some frameworks that of what's likely to lay ahead in that. Can you walk us through, sort of what are the areas that that are going to be areas of priority, and promise, and that are promised in any
the problem right now is that we're looking at just the extension of the TCJA tax cuts costs somewhere between 3.9 and 4.8 trillion. And then spending, there's been talk about spending increases to Homeland and Defense, which costs between 100 billion and 300 billion. And I know these are big ranges even for Washington, but it's because the details of the bill haven't been put together yet. And then, as you've probably all heard, President Trump has talked about other priorities, no tax on tips. That could be cost anywhere between 100 and 300 billion. No tax on Social Security. That's probably 550 plus billion. affixed to the state and local tax issue for individuals. That's another 200 billion to 1.2 trillion. And possible auto loan deductibility or domestic production credits. And those are all just things that, some of them are definitely going to be in the bill, and some of those are things that we've heard President Trump indicate an interest in accomplishing. And if you were taking notes and doing the math on that, you'd see that's a pretty big number.
Mhm. Yeah, and Tristan, just as a follow-up, earlier this year, the House Budget Committee had put out, a number of provisions within, and those included a whole laundry list of potential items, including some areas on increased immigration fees and areas, that could be coming in.
That's exactly right, Michael. There are a number of other areas aside from the moving tax deduction exclusion that are important to us that could play out within budget reconciliation. And also one thing that has made it a little bit more of a challenge with the moving tax deduction and exclusion is the fact that what Tracy described in the House passing just yesterday is that they have agreed to use a current spending level as the basis for moving forward. So in totality, they have to come up with less money because they're not having to cover the cost of extending all of the tax provisions from the 2017 tax law. However, on the flip side for us, since we were suspended, it does include that suspension within that number. So we essentially, instead of going from a situation of being paused, are now going to a situation of being reinstated, and almost while we wouldn't do this, having to come up with money to offset the cost of that now. So it does play out to be a bit of a more challenge with how they've done this structurally from a spending standpoint.
And this also includes a number of other provisions that, both that were suspended, but then elements that had expired previously that fall outside the scope of the current policy baseline that have to be accounted for within the considerations of new items coming in. And a question for both of you, and the big question, and particularly in light of the challenges and pushback that we've already seen, particularly from budget and deficit hawks in the Republican caucuses in the House and Senate, is the question of how do we pay for this? And we've talked about some of the areas again, and in the budget committee, outlining a whole wish list of potential items, as starting points of thinking through this. But again, lots of things have been, being talked around in Washington about how do we pay for this. And so with that, what are some of the other areas that are being talked about? And do you see sort of how is this playing out between the House and the Senate in terms of both the thinking and the conversation?
Well, I'll just jump in here and say that, the numbers they're throwing out just don't add up to enough money. For the 3.9 to 4.8 just extension, and for all the other things that have been added to it. I mean, one commonly discussed area where they're hoping to get funds is Medicaid fraud, but that just is not nearly enough money. And then, there's been talk of cutting some benefits, but then there's also a lot of opposition to that. So to answer your question, it's unclear right now. There had been a preliminary list that was sort of leaked out that was probably a 10-page list of different options of things they could use to pay for. But right now that's really unclear. And Tristan, you might be able to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, Tracy is right on point. There's no real way they can get to the level of the numbers that they have been throwing around without touching some of the entitlement programs. I think the president has said Social Security is off the table, Medicare is off the table, and right, Tracy had mentioned Medicaid, and that they're not going to cut Medicaid, but they are going to improve efficiencies and look at fraud and abuse and kind of use some of the scenario or wording of how they've addressing some of the other areas of the federal government. And it's a big number. It's $880 billion is what they have requested from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which has oversight over Medicaid. And we've seen, especially on the Senate side, a number of members come out in opposition of doing really big, large cuts to entitlement programs. And it's not just from the more moderates, but it's also from some of the conservatives who have states that really have a high Medicaid population and really rely on some of the federal spending programs. So that's right. A lot of the discussion and items have been kind of pushed back for reconciliation. So a lot of the really tough negotiations are still yet to come.
And this, in this point, is critically important, particularly, in context of, Tracy, what you mentioned, a few minutes ago in terms of the margins in both the Senate, but particularly in the House with a 2-vote margin, where we nearly saw some of these questions about Medicaid and some of the, talked about cuts, that, were part of the areas that held, that held up the conversations in passing the budget instructions yesterday. So likely this question is going to be a very important process, but in a much narrower framework than what we even saw in 2017.
Yeah, agreed.
One question, given all of this, and Tracy, this is for you, what are we thinking and hearing in terms of timing for the reconciliation tax process to pass this year?
Well, what we're hearing and what we're thinking are two different things.
Yeah.
The leadership had actually originally said that by now we would have the whole thing done. Clearly it's not. The next goal is by the Memorial Day recess, which is at the end of May. That's 6 weeks away, 2 weeks. They're out for 2 weeks for the Easter recess. Most people, I think the smart money is on it not getting done by then, and extending out into probably either the end of July or much later in the year. It could go as late. Really, their deadline is the end of the year because of the tax, changes in the tax provisions. So very unclear when they'll get it done. I think the point is they're only now entering the really tough part of this process, and it's taken this long to get there. I mean, one variable, they've put the increasing the debt ceiling, which has to be done in this bill. They could do it separately if things are delayed, but the debt limit's supposed to be hit sometime this summer. So, there's a lot of variables. So I think it's too early to tell, but I think that most people believe that this will be going on through at least the summer, if not into the fall.
Great. And Tristan, in terms of in terms of all of this, what does this landscape mean for tax provisions like the moving expense tax deduction, and sort of, how what may or may not occur, in the coming months?
Yeah, so I think as far as reinstating the moving tax expense tax deduction and reduction, that we're probably better off if it is a more dragged out timeline, so that we continue to further educate members of Congress about the both individual as well as economic impact and benefit of the two tax deductions. We have been working carefully once again with the American Trucking Association, International Association of Movers for the last year and a half, even longer. Really never stopped fighting for the reinstatement, even going back to some of the American Rescue Plan and some of the efforts during the COVID pandemic on economic benefits. So we have already weighed in with the House Ways and Means tax teams that have been meeting and talking since last October with a formal letter from our three organizations in support of the reinstatement. We have reached out to all members and done a letter to both the Senate Finance Committee leadership as well as Ways and Means Committee leadership, and sent letters to every member of Senate Finance and the House Ways and Means Tax Subcommittee as the two primary committees in the subcommittee of jurisdiction over this issue, kind of, really reinforcing the need and the impact on middle-class families of the deduction and exclusion not being reinstated. So we continue to look for opportunities. We've been doing mutual Zoom calls with the other organizations with key offices to hopefully solidify additional support. So we continue to press on hopefully getting them reinstated. But as we noted earlier, our job just became that much harder with Congress passing a budget that does use a current baseline for moving forward.
Mhm. And and as a follow-up, with that, one and this is a question for both of you. One of the things, and we've heard Senator Crapo, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has come out and said in the Senate that that he has a list of, at least as of a month ago, 200 and counting provisions that different senators had raised, for potential inclusion, in addressing within the tax code, and likely, a similar number, that Ways and Means has as well. And so with this framework and a focus on the, with a focus on trying to, make sure that that the Congress addresses the extension TCJA, before the end of the year, and addressing, not having the tax hike that Tracy, you had talked about earlier. What does this mean for some of those other provisions and sort of the opportunity for continued engagement, even outside of the context of the TCJA extension conversation?
Well, I think there's a couple things that could happen. I'll just jump in here and Tristan, tell me if you think I'm wrong. But I think a couple things could happen. One, this bill, it's a very real possibility that it dies of its own weight and they do and they do an extension. I don't think that'll happen, but that could happen. Another thing that, is a possibility is they pass a very narrow bill that just has, the extension of the extension of the tax provisions and a couple of President Trump's key priorities, like the border, more money for DHS, the tax on tips, Social Security, just very, very narrow, none of those other provisions. And then there is later in the year, a bipartisan tax bill that is pulled together with some of these other priorities. A little unclear at this time, but I think, any of those things could happen. Tristan, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm in absolute agreement, Tracy, because, we've talked about budget reconciliation, and what we're talking about is budget reconciliation for FY 2025. So they do have FY 2026 as another vehicle that they can use in the budget reconciliation process. They'd have to once again come to an agreement on an overall budget resolution and then a second FY 26 budget reconciliation package. So I think you're spot on. I think, right, there hasn't been a whole lot of external public pressure on getting some of the other items done. But if we do see kind of the border become, obviously it's been a high profile issue, but has been kind of in the background as we deal with tariffs and other things. If there are certain areas of the president's agenda, such as the border, immigration, that start to flare up, I think it'll put increase the pressure on doing, two separate packages as you lined out, to try to move something sooner and then leave the tax piece for later.
There has been that, I'm just adding to that, there definitely is a little bit of that chatter, I think, in Washington and on the Hill about doing, bifurcating some of these things, which just provides another opportunity, potentially.
No, absolutely. And in terms of, and final question for both of you, why is it, with everything that we've talked about, why is it important for the talent mobility industry to share their voice on the moving expense tax deduction and exclusion, and to be able to tell the story about why reinstating is important for companies and transferees and for the talent mobility industry?
I'll start, Tracy, and then just please jump in. As I think we both outlined earlier, we are now starting as of yesterday, from almost a more of a deficit situation, right? We are now having to be proactive on reinstating the deduction rather than just letting the suspension elapse. So Congress is not going to do that unless they hear from their constituents who are directly impacted by the fact that we could maybe not see the exclusion and deduction come back into place. So it really, members of Congress, while they enjoy talking to Tracy and I, they're not going to move the needle for us. They're going to do it for their constituents. And unless they hear from their constituents, they are going to think that it's not a priority, it's not a concern, and then they're not going to weigh in support of the issue. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And they want to hear those stories. They want to hear what this has done and why it's been a problem. On the website, I know there are great, talking points and issue papers that really kind of outline it, but you all know better than we do about the pain that it's causing. And to be able to express those to your members of Congress and your representatives, that's their job, to listen to you and to help you out when there are issues. So it's really, without those stories, it's hard to move them.
No, absolutely. And we've seen firsthand with meetings on Capitol Hill, as we've had members from the talent mobility industry tell offices about the impact, the value and resonance that these stories have when you all share the stories and what you're seeing in your organizations, regardless of being a service provider or corporate organization. And as Tracy mentioned, we have a page on the WRC website under the public policy section with more information on the moving expense tax deduction and information on the how you can get involved and your organizations can get involved in helping to support the reinstatement effort and to be able to share your stories with and experience with on Capitol Hill. And there's a lot of moving pieces as we've talked about today. So and a lot of things to watch, particularly as Tracy mentioned earlier, we're at the end of the first step of a multi-step process with all of this. And so it's going to be important for all of us within the industry to continue to stay engaged, but also continue to engage and share your stories and impacts with the Hill. And we will certainly have future conversations to update in, but reach out. Tracy, Tristan, and myself are here to support you all as the industry, address any questions that you have. And we really appreciate and Tracy, Tristan, really appreciate you sharing this update and your insights today. And and thank you all for joining today.